Assalamu alaikum and good morning. This is Malik Mujahid, and you're watching Muslim Network. You can always watch us at Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and of course on our own website, muslimnetwork.tv, YouTube, Facebook pages, and pretty soon on Apple TV as well. And we are at a time when we are forced to think about bigger thing in life, not just ourselves, but everybody else, all the human beings together. I'm going to read you something which is very critical for me and very important for the Muslim community. And this is the very first anti-racism statement by anyone in the history. And that was delivered by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in his last sermon. And he told people, this may be my last, so hear me carefully. And he says, all mankind, I read, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab. A non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. And also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over white, except by piety and good action. America is on the street for that egalitarian society in which all human beings are one, treated in the same way. But as America has taken to the street to demand an end to police brutality and violence, unfortunately, the police have responded with more violence. I mean, sometimes it is difficult to understand whether the police is rioting or the people are rioting. When I see around the White House, it definitely looks like police and military and all sort of police is around rioting against peaceful protesters. Many of them are clergy. As we struggle for justice for George Floyd, our brother, and others, let's celebrate also the struggle for justice. We have achieved few things. While we are marching around on the 10th and the 11th day, remember there were people who rebelled against slavery. Juneteenth is coming up, which is also known as Freedom Day or the Jubilee Day or Celebration Day, an American holiday which should be celebrated throughout America, but at least Texas state celebrates that at this moment, official holiday. But rest of the America is catching up. And immediately after June 19th, which is known as Juneteenth Day, there is a June 20th. And the whole world of poor people in America are going to be marching, but unfortunately cannot march nowadays. So it will be a virtual march against poverty. And its website is june2020.org. And this is the time to listen. And nobody said, but someone who doesn't speak a whole lot, President Bush, he said, this is not the time for us to lecture. It is time for us to listen. It is time for America to examine our tragic failure. I will say that let's listen to our guest. Our guest today is Dr. Professor Courtney Joseph. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you so much for having me.
She's assistant professor of history at African American Studies at the Lake Forest College in Illinois. She teaches African American history and culture, including a class on Black freedom struggles across the African diaspora. Her research looks at Haitian community in Chicago as well, and we will touch all those subjects. So Tell us. I know we'll be talking about your research about the black television because we are the Muslim television. We're learning from the history of struggle. We'll touch there a little later, but tell us, do you think the protest which is ongoing is going to change anything? Because there are a lot of cynics out there that protest doesn't change anything.
First, again, I just want to say thank you for having me on the show today, Malik, and I really look forward to having this conversation with you. And shout out to my student and your intern, Zara Nadim, for inviting me here today. So thank you, Zara. Um, I do believe that our current protests will lead to change because the history says that, especially the history of America, tells us that that is typically how change happens. Whether we go to the quote founding of America, and I always use quotes around that, right? Because this is an indigenous land first and all foremost. But the revolt against the British is what binds us with the United States of America as a country today. And that, was a protest, that was a revolt, that was sustained. And so I'm hopeful by what I'm seeing that we're in a similar position to hopefully lead to some real change in society.
So in that way, protest is probably more American than apple pie.
Absolutely. I don't even know what the origins of apple pie are, although I love apple pie. I'm a fan of apple pie, but I don't know how American it is. I do know for sure that protests and rebellion and resistance have led to a lot of the things that make America America. Whether that's the 8-hour workday, those are labor protests. The weekend, which is something that now we live with and we think is this thing that's always been there, but that was rebellion. Those were protests of working people who led to that. And so in America. And so again, I hope, and I'm keeping an eye on what I hope is momentum forward.
And right here in Chicago, that is right. I mean, the labor movement. I mean, I was very sad, and my office was about a block away from Oprah Winfrey's studio, and because she's getting so much money, I had to run away from that place. I was there for 10 years. But when President Clinton visited the Union Park, at that time they moved away the Statue of Mary, which was installed on the corner of Randolph uh, and Denrine, in memory of those people who died in the struggle for labor rights, because people were dying on the working, and nobody will stand up for them. So in that way, the major gift to America through protest, and not only the current American system, started because of rebellion, but labor rights. Tell us a little bit about the protest. Let's go back to 1968. Many people are comparing what is happening nowadays in last 10 days with 68. Do you see there is a comparison, or it is too early to compare because that resulted in a longer movement which has a real legislative impact?
Yes, I think it's too early for us to be able to make comparisons in terms of time and what other moments in history in America feel like this. But I do think it's a good place for us to start, at least when thinking about a really pivotal moment. There are similarities, but there are differences, Malik, as you just pointed out to. Similarities that it is part of the way that historians kind of talk about 1968, they call it the long 1968, as part of the long 1960s, this idea that 1968 is kind of a peak to an era dating back really to, I would argue, the 1940s, moving through the early 1970s of sustained attempts at different strategies of rebellion, right? Whether they're nonviolent, whether they're economic boycotts, and I'll get back to the nonviolent thing at some point, I'm sure, but whether they're sit-ins, whether they're lunch counter protests, we see that all kind of culminate in that 1968 period, which is also similar because it's undergirded by a real tragic moment. So 1968 marks the assassinations of both Dr. King and Robert F. Kennedy within about 2.5, 3 months of each other. People that young people had been looking up to over the last, again, long 1960s period of being purveyors of potential progress. And they're both assassinated in very violent and public ways. And so there's already this level of sadness and tragedy there that leads to a spark, which leads to these urban, protests that are often in urban areas, right? Centralized. Similarly to today, we're already dealing with COVID-19 and what that means, and the health disparities and racial inequalities that are showing that Black and brown people are more at risk of fatality due to this. When you then have a video that puts the already on the table conversation about police brutality and, quote, vigilante justice that polices people of color in this country, when it's put on that sort of display again, on top of that, like I said, that era of tragedy or that like moment of tragedy, you see something like this. And so those are like similarities, right? Differences though, there was already a move, if we're thinking about the 1954 Brown versus Board, followed by Brown versus Board 2 in 55. And then there's, Civil Rights Act of 65 and Voting Rights Act and all of that. So wave of legislation that comes through 1968, we're seeing a Democratic presidency and a Democratic leaning Congress as well, that's pushing for legislation as the answer. I would say we're in a different period now where we don't necessarily right now, at least in June 5th, 2020, have a majority push politically in our federal government that would answer these protests in the way that LBJ did in the 1960s.
So you were saying that what I understood from your explanation, Professor, is that there were building blocks of that movement, and there were a right political equation which used those building blocks to have see a bigger movement, and then a political commitment because of the political situation of that time, which resulted in a clear, both things. Clear violence in which two leaders were murdered, who were somewhat in connection with each other, but at the same time pushed LBJ, the President Johnson, to make the changes which were very much coming. So it was a buildup of things.
Yeah.
How do you compare this? I had I was in Montgomery a few years ago, and of course I walked the bridge in the rain.
Mm.
And it's a small bridge. When I read about the violence, I thought, oh my God, it's a pretty big place. It seems like in a small place, they were just doing everything horrible possible. It's not a very long bridge. It's not a very wide bridge. But one of the things which which stayed with me very deep in my heart, actually, I didn't have enough napkins to handle my nose and my ears, my eyes at that place. And it was the museum of where people, lynching museum, let's call it. I don't know what is the formal name. The way that they have defined that, it was so I mean, it very simple, but extremely powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And now political situation is such that a senator is holding anti-lynching legislature, and the most articulate people are still the people of color. So the political equation of at that time and at this time seems to be a little bit, not little bit, will be sort of a British style of understatement. I thought this will be a no-brainer to pass something like that. You see what I'm saying?
I agree, and I mean, lots of things to unpack there from what you said. I'll first say that we live on the sites of all of this history all the time, and if you pay attention, you can kind of feel it, like you said, that overcoming of emotion that you felt walking that bridge. I had a similar reaction when I visited the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was assassinated. Just upon seeing it and upon being in that space, I just was overcome with emotion. Um, and so it's important for us to think about that, right? That's always with us, whether we're paying attention to it or not. The history of lynching in this country is very long. And one of the people who inspired me to do what I do is Ida B. Wells, Ida Wells Barnett, a Chicagoan, a Black woman who made it her life's work to tell the truth about lynching. Lynching, which is generally known by historians and others as the extrajudicial killing of a person. And in America, oftentimes the people were Black, often Black men, but Black women and children as well. And the ties to lynching are that they, again, are this idea of policing Black people in the years after slavery is over, because we don't have enough time, Malik, to go through all of that. But there needs to be a way to police Black freedom and Black bodies and Black people. For those who could not wrap their mind around the idea that now property had turned into people, although they'd always been people, we're talking about enslaved Black people. You would think, based on the Lynching Museum, which shout out to Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative, and again in Ida B. Wells and many others who captured that history and reminded people that it wasn't what we were told, what we were being told about why Black people were being killed and hung in very public ways that the town would show up to and people would take pictures of and pass postcards around the country. And I mean, you can find these things on eBay to this day. That it's not because of the quote crimes that these Black people were quote doing, supposedly. It was more so about the fact that they had broken the social contract of Blackness, which is to stay in a place that is subservient to whiteness in this country. And if we as a country, again, shout out to Brian Stevenson, if we as a country cannot reconcile with what the truth of what that really is, even though we have all of the research and all of the literature, like I said, Ida B. Wells was alive almost 100 years ago at this point. The Red Record is about 100 years old at this point. That tells us what this is really about. We can't go to the Lynching Museum and sit with it and live with it. Then we can argue against an anti-lynching bill in 2020.
Well, thank you, Dr. Courtney Joseph, for being with us. We'll be right back after these messages. You're watching Muslim Network TV. We're always on Galaxy 19 satellite, as well as Amazon Fire TV, Roku TV, and always on muslimnetwork.tv. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. We're talking with Professor Joseph here. This is Malik Mujahid. We are on satellite Galaxy 19, as well as Amazon TV and Roku and Muslim Network.tv. The debate about violence and nonviolence goes on. And what I see here is that protest is against police violence. And again, police is using violence against protest. Now, there is some looting here and there, but one of these days I want to talk about the history of looting. Sometimes some team wins and people are looting, and sometimes a team loses and people are looting and rioting. So keep that element of crime aside. But people are, a professor, for example, Professor Omar Wasaw, I don't know which university he's part of. I think he's in Princeton. He's worried that 1968 riot brought Nixon, who ran as a law and order candidate. Now, one can wonder if Trump is a Nixon or not, but but he's worried about we may win little battle, but we may lose to a leader who is hardly a leader. So there is a debate popping up on that, and some people saying, okay, what the rioting brought in Ferguson. Well, some people are answering that, well, riot took place, but for the first time now there is a black mayor. Answer to that is Chicago has a black mayor who has increased the police funding by 7%. So now almost 50% of Chicago city money goes in policing. So talk about a little bit about this violence and nonviolence. But before you do that, there is a person who, she's a New York Times, I think, journalist. She says, and I quote from her Twitter, the civil rights movement was quote unquote not nonviolent. It was sparked by violence, beginning with brutal beating of black servicemen coming home from war. And while black protesters were trained to be nonviolent, they courted quote unquote white violence as a strategy. And then she said there is a lot of contention on here about the uprising in Minneapolis and how the only means protester can be effective is through nonviolence. I heard for the destruction like everyone else, but she says, but the fact of history is nonviolent protest has not been successful for Black Americans. So there is a debate out there. Not a whole lot of debate, but I think 21,000 people liked her, 7,000 people retweeted, and a discussion got generated. So you being a professor of Black history, how do you see? I mean, I say, although Malcolm X was not involved in any violence, he died a violent death. Dr. King was not involved in violence, he died a violent death. So one can say that, probably the voice of Dr. King became important for liberal whites in juxtaposition of the voice of Malcolm X. So I said a whole lot of things, but just consider me like a student who is wondering, and I'm looking for you to deliberate thoughtfully.
Best kind of student to have for me is, having done some research already and has good questions and good points to bring up. Nonviolence and violence are not dichotomous, right? They're not on two sides and opposing each other. I like to think of these as part of a spectrum of strategies used by Black people and other people across the world to enact change. Again, I listed some earlier, whether it's an economic boycott, We'll give the Montgomery bus boycott that launched Dr. King's career as a leader. It was at the age of 26, right? Like a young man, not who knew for him at that point that would launch him into, the international sphere. Anywho, that was a bus boycott sparked by Rosa Parks, who had strategized with others in the area to sit on that bus on that day and to follow the plan that they had come up with. See, we really like to think of protests as random, or these things that come out of nowhere and people just are tired one day and they all just grab pitchforks and run out of their houses and they're taking to the streets. And suddenly they have all these signs made and they all know where to go at the same time. It doesn't work like that. The activists are people who have been talking about this for years before it becomes public, for years before it becomes something that a lot of people are talking about or a lot of people are involved in. And so they decide in those moments whether they believe to go a quote, nonviolent, direct action way, a sit-in, a march, a protest, or they may decide, the Black Panther Party, who often people look at as, again, the opposite of Dr. King or Malcolm X, the opposite person. It's not the case. It's this idea of self-defense. It's this idea of, if somebody is going to physically assault me as a human being, I should be able to defend myself. If somebody for years is going to be throwing, you have to think about how Dr. King's house was firebombed with his wife and his newborn inside of the house, like constantly assaulting, constantly getting assaulted. At some point, some folks are going to say, we need to have a way to defend ourselves. And that's where you see people saying, well, you're promoting violence. I think it's misinterpreted. Not that there aren't people who, and I am a proud Haitian American who comes from two Haitian parents and come from an island that led the very first successful slave revolt and led to the very first Black independent republic in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, they did burn it all down, basically. And violence in some ways begets violence, because you look at the history of that colony, of that island, that was one of the most violent slave colonies in the West. People from other colonies, including the US, the colonies, were sending what they deemed to be recalcitrant Black people who could not fold to becoming slavery to Haiti because the violence enacted was so brutal. So sometimes you have to look at, before we start to critique whether we should be violent or nonviolent, look at what they're responding to, right? I mean, I see people, being concerned about businesses and we should we're hurting businesses and why are we burning our own community? I understand that, but there's room for righteous anger, and there's room for understanding that they're not the source of that anger or that violence. They are responding to centuries at this point of such violence.
So your point essentially is non-violence or violence, both are not in vacuum.
No.
They're interconnected, and one behavior is inspiring another behavior. So there is an action and there is a reaction. So you're essentially not teaching history, but science, I guess.
Who knew? And I am not good at science, Malik. It is not. I'm a historian all the way through. So thank you for that. Reaction and reaction. Yes. I mean, we have to, again, wrestle with, where is this coming from? All of this new, and this may be more science, right? There's new research that says that trauma is in our DNA. Trauma can be passed down. And so if that's true, then we're looking at how a severely traumatized people are reacting to the present moment.
I think you need to have a Twitter handle. Probably you already do. You need to communicate with Nicole Hannah Jones. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist at New York Times. And she is coming out by saying that, the violence, non-violence movement hasn't worked for Black history. Of course, we have Black Panthers, not the movie, but the actual people.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have a preacher of nonviolence. I mean, we should always preach nonviolence, insist on nonviolence, but at the same time recognize the role of action and reaction in building a movement. Without that, probably not much attention will be paid by those people who want to engage. Media will be sitting crying if both elements are not there. Because what is there to cover? The same silent people with the same placard, marching in the same way, day after day. They're looking for a variety of scene, I guess. So with that, we're going to switch to conversation about the Black television, which you have studied, and its role. But before we do that, I'm talking with Professor Joseph here from Illinois. This is Malik Mujahid on Mujahid Talks, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. This is the only television Muslims have in America. We are on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and always on muslimnetwork.tv. We'll be right back after these messages.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. Past campaigns covered a wide range of humanitarian concerns. Through Bosnia Task Force, imams and leaders of Chicago's Muslim community worked to ensure Bosnia became a top national issue. This led to life-saving American policies in Bosnia. A key accomplishment was helping to get rape declared a war crime. Initiatives also included Kosovo Task Force, Central African Republic Task Force, and Flint Coalition, which brought awareness to the water crisis affecting the people of Flint, Michigan. Highlights of our work include supporting Black Lives Matter, Parliament of the World Religions, addressing climate change.
So wasteful consumption starts the ruthless production, and that's where we need all the fossil fuel in the world.
And prominent media exposure.
This is Imam Malik Mujahid, President of Justice for All.
And I'm the Director of Outreach for Justice for All.
And that's why we need to go back to what worked.
Today we're demanding an apology from the CEO of Costco.
The Chinese crackdown on Uyghurs and other Turkic people has only gotten worse.
Current programs such as Burma Task Force advocate for the rights of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, internally displaced populations, and all those denied freedom of movement and at risk of starvation. Through this, we mobilized thousands of calls to elected representatives. This paved the way for the U.S. to increase funding for Rohingya refugees from $30 million to $210 million. Two of our documentaries were featured on international news outlets. The Rohingya People, A Slow-Burning Genocide on BBC World News, and Rohingya Refugees Tell of Massacre was featured on CNN. We've organized rallies, UN mission visits, expanded presentations on campuses, promoted research and report writing, outreach to think tanks, media, and other influencers. Faith Coalition educates about the Rohingya genocide and crimes against humanity faced by ethnic groups in Burma. We've traveled to refugee camps, convened a meeting of Karen, Kachin, and Rohingya leaders, both to encourage cooperation and to guide them in congressional outreach. We organized Rohingya Advocacy Day. This led to over 100 participants visiting the offices of 60 U.S. senators and congressional representatives. Free Kashmir advocates for the people of Kashmir. Long-term goals include the call for self-determination, the end of the Indian military's occupation of the territory, and raising awareness of Kashmiri issues among the American people. After the August 5th reinvasion of Kashmir, we organized national protests in front of various Indian government buildings, partnered with Stand with Kashmir, and launched a petition condemning the Gates Foundation's decision to present Prime Minister Modi a humanitarian award. Save Uyghur informs Muslims and neighbors of other faiths about the ongoing cultural genocide of Uyghur Muslims and mobilizes public support. Our projects include boycotting Chinese products with our Fast from China campaign, pushing Bill S-178 in the Senate, and organizing a nationwide protest of Costco. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Malik Mujahid, your host, and I'm talking with Professor Joseph here. And we're talking about rebellion and protests, whether it works, it doesn't work, violence and non-violence, how they're connected or disconnected, how political change comes into being. A lot of pain of history is in today's conversation. But I hope you're learning as I'm learning. And it's time for America to sit and listen to those who know this better than I do and you do. And that's why, Professor Joseph, we are really thankful for you being with us today.
Thank you.
Tell us, what is the history of Black television, when it is started? I hope it is started better than the way we have started Muslim television.
I don't know if it's much better of a story. So I have the pleasure of teaching a history of Black television course on campus. And what my students and I do is look at first the relationship between theater and film and their representations of Black people and how that impacts what comes on Black television. And so we actually start the class in the early 20th century, looking at, in particular, the film Birth of a Nation, as well as looking at Blackface performances, vaudeville, those being sources and spaces where Black people, quotes, are being represented in popular media. And so 1915 is when Birth of a Nation, based on the D.W. Griffith novel that's called The Klansman, comes out. And it is a revisionist history of the Civil War, and that places this idea of the Confederacy being part of a noble lost cause, and that it was a mistake. The freeing of African Americans was a mistake. And so you see Black people presented in what become these archetypes of Black people in media. Historians, scholars of media kind of bracket these into, but you have this idea of an Uncle Tom, or a coon, or for Black women, a mammy, or a sapphire. These ideas of one-dimensional Blackness that we still see today in television, right? Because what happens from Birth of a Nation, which, by the way, I should mention, was shown at the White House in 1915 as a way of saying, he called it, President Wilson called it, the best thing he had seen, one of the, like a monument in media and in film. And so that, alongside with, again, blackface performances, which really show Black people as lazy and only there for entertainment and not smart, and whether it's Black children who are just childless, this idea of a pickaninny. These images, often performed by white folks in blackface makeup, translates to radio, translates to television. So the very first Black television show is the Amos and Andy show, which was it had been a radio show where the two men were voiced by white men. And then eventually there were some blackface performances before it becomes starring actually Black actors. And so I spend a lot of time wrestling with my students about, well, why do people like the men who are in Amos and Andy or, Hattie McDaniel, why do they play these stereotypical roles? Why would they do that to themselves if they know that they're reinforcing stereotypes about their own group? Problem is that, and I don't think I can better say it to Hattie McDaniel's point, that she's quoted as saying she would rather play a maid on television or in movies than in real life. That she at least could pay her bills and live somewhat of a decent life by playing maybe a maid in front of the camera versus the domestic servitude that Black women, had been doing and have been doing for centuries, right? And so we see Black people still taking on these roles and then pushing them to the brink of trying to push back against the stereotypes until you come into things like the 1960s with the Julia show, and then the 1970s where you have a first golden age of Black television where now you can see Black people beyond the stereotypes. The stereotypes never go away. That's the thing. And so there's a history with how imagery of Black people in popular media feeds into the narratives that lead to things like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown. These stereotypes of Black people as dangerous, as, less than, as people who miss slavery and miss servitude and were happier under those conditions, that plays into it.
So that reminds me more or less today how Muslims in India are portrayed by their very powerful television industry, but that's how they still are portraying Muslims there. But when did a Black on television came into being?
Well,
what did they contribute in some unique way?
Black on television begins with, I believe, the Black entertainment television, and that doesn't happen, BET as it's better known, until the 1980s. And that's why, as tragic as it only adds to the tragedy of the story of Bill Cosby to look at how pivotal he was to opening up Black television to be told by and owned by Black folks, because the Cosby Show is a pivotal show that changes the imagery of Black people on television. And so to kind of see where that ends is unfortunate, but for another day. I will also say that the activists of the civil rights movement, in the quote that you mentioned earlier, were very aware of how to use the media in their favor. And I would say that's something we see as a similarity today, that activists and young people who are savvy with media know how to deploy it so that their messaging can get out there. So, activists knew, as they said, that if they go and that they are peaceful, right, and do not respond in self-defense, that what that imagery shows is who's being violent against whom, who should really have the fear. And while that may not impact us, that imagery or that conversation nationally, what it did and what I see it sparking today is international conversation about how is America really supposedly the land of the free that it says it is in all parts of the world, if we can see that certain citizens are not being subject to the same treatment?
Tell us, I mean, you're helping me understand and cover topics for an audience who are very sympathetic but do not have a deep knowledge of the subject matter in the Muslim community. But Muslim community is African American. I mean, close to 30% of Muslims in America are African Americans. And so it is our history. But the immigrant portion of our community empathizes. They got all those teaching, as I quoted of Prophet Muhammad, that no white has superiority over black and no black has superiority over white. So those teachings are there. I mean, and one of the very popular name in Muslim community is Bilal, which is my son is named Bilal also, although he has blue eyes for some reason. I don't know how these human genetics work. And he's a person who was a black slave who was liberated by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and he was his treasurer in a way, that all the money he will be controlling and things like that. But knowledge of history in America, do you think, I mean, I want to talk to you about Haitian and Chicago and about Haiti a little bit, if you allow me, but do you think that students today in America, black and white and all the shades in between, are better aware of the history of black struggle in this country as compared to, say, 15, 20 years ago?
Yes and no. I will say that American history as taught to children and to teenagers, we're talking K through 12, is in dire straits and has been for some time. The majority of textbooks that are sourced in schools are made in Texas. And if we know, you brought up Juneteenth, the reason that Juneteenth is the date is because Texas was the last state to hear about the end of slavery, almost, you know.
Wait a minute, why Texas has a monopoly on this?
So there's a lot more there, but I'm trying to remember the name of the company itself, but they're based in Texas, and because of how capitalism works, I'll just say for a short answer, they have a monopoly on many of the textbooks that are sourced to the country. Their view of indigenous history, of African American history, of slavery, of all of these things, I mean, shows the history of where it's based. And so what I find as a college professor, and I wanted to be an educator for as long as I can remember, and I love children and really thought maybe I could teach younger children, but I realized that the place that I would be able to tell the most truth was in college. And so unfortunately, what I find is that students who come into my classroom, this is the first they're hearing of really a lot of the detail that we're talking about today. And that's hard for them, many of them, because in the words of Rachel Cargle, who's an activist and academic, or an alternative academic who I follow and everyone should follow, she calls it the great unlearning, right? And that there's this moment where you have to unlearn these messages from the media, from the schools, all of that, in order to then really understand where these things are coming from. So I don't blame a lot of folks for not knowing, because the places that they would hear about it are not really giving them all of this detail. At the same time, social media has changed a lot of things for younger people, and whether it's Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, or my students are going to laugh when I say this, but the tickety-tock, the one that I'm too old for, it's a thing called TikTok. I mean, I don't understand it, but they love it. And from what I understand, those are mediums where I'm seeing students share this information younger with each other. So there's, yes, if we are reliant on the institutions to teach this history, we're going to be lacking. But if we go for it and we do just a little bit of Googling, a little bit of searching, you can find it on your own as well.
If you're a seeker, it's easier now. But if you're going to live by the Texas book, it will be difficult for you to get there, right?
Right.
My goodness, this Texas, we need to liberate Texas finally, one of these days.
It's a beautiful state. I lived in Austin for a year.
Oh, Austin. Well, Austin is not Texas quite.
Everybody tells me, and maybe you're right.
Okay, so we get a few minutes left. Tell me, the Haiti, where the first successful rebellion took place, although there were rebellion in Baja and Brazil, where Muslims were very actively involved. In Louisiana, there were Muslims who were slave rebellion, they were involved. But Haiti was the one which became the first successful and independent country. But you say there is a secret history of Chicago and Haiti. What is that, and why you're keeping it secret?
I'm not keeping it a secret. I'm hoping that when I finally finish this book that I've been writing based on my dissertation, that it's not so secret anymore. But a lot of my research, as you said, focuses on the connections between Haiti and Chicago. One, for personal reasons. As I mentioned, my parents are Haitian immigrants. Shout out mom and dad. They came to Chicago actually very funny and ironically in 1968 and 1969. That's when my parents migrated to the city of Chicago. And so I'm the youngest of three girls, and I grew up very entrenched in the Haitian community in Chicago and understanding that that was my culture and my heritage and all of that. And then as I would leave the house or I would leave kind of the community and go to school or go to other things, I realized that nobody was really aware that there was this community widely. And so I found myself loving history from a young age and found myself eventually pursuing a PhD in history and looking for a topic that I wanted to research, and realized again, people still were not aware of the connection between Haiti and Chicago, which is strong because the founder, the first non-native settler who builds a business and a home in Chicago, is a man of Haitian descent, Jean-Baptiste Pointe-Dussab.
Really?
Yes.
Oh man, I have been supporter of that museum, visited, organized conferences there, but somehow I missed this connection.
Well, the Dussab Museum is part of a legacy in Chicago of Black people across the diaspora to claim this Black father of Chicago. There's not always, because historians are, quote, unsure if Dussab is from Haiti or not, because we don't have any written archival document that says that. But the oral histories, both indigenous and those of Black people in Chicago, points to him being a person from the island of Saint-Domingue. It also makes sense with the history if you think about it being French Illinois. You know, at the time, this is the area that gets sold in the Louisiana Purchase after the Haitian Revolution. So Haitian people are at the center of starting Chicago. And we look at the story of Dussab to understand how not only Chicago forms as this multicultural commerce hub, right? Because he has the first successful business long-term in Chicago as a fur trader and a trader in general. But he is married to an indigenous woman, a Potawatomi woman named Kitty Hawa. They have these interracial children who are, raised Catholic in the city, and he trades with indigenous people and the French and the English. And so to understand that, both you and I, Malik, and so many people across the world can come to Chicago and find some success, I think we have to look at Dussab in order to understand that. I also would say that in order to understand how Haitians eventually, because it takes another 200 or so years for other Haitian people to start to come to Chicago and live there and stay there. And now you have our Attorney General of Chicago is a Haitian man, Kwame Raoul, the son of two Haitian immigrants who are part of this story. And so, so my book and my research really looks at how the two spaces have been connected in both of their histories and how it helps us to understand the communal formations in both places.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. I truly appreciate you being with us on Muslim Network TV and enlightening me personally, as well as people who are watching us. Thank you so much.
And I see that there's some questions, and I'm sure you all can share my contact info if anybody has any questions. But I really appreciate being on today. Thank you so much, Malik, for this show.
Thank you so much. You can always watch us on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and pretty soon on Apple TV, and always on muslimnetwork.tv and related social media. And thank you so much for our assistant professor, producer, well, could be assistant professor one of these days, Zahra Nadeem, for bringing this professor to our show today. And thank you, our producer, Connor Mays, and our intern, Sumaya Heather. And you can always watch Muslim Network TV 24/7. Thank you so much. Peace. Salam.